Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to Illinois Stories. I'm Mark McDonald in Springfield at the Illinois State Museum, where a new exhibit just opened, Civil War Quilters, the Loyal Hearts of Illinois. Now, there's a lot more in this exhibit than quilts, but quilts are exemplary of the touch that the women gave to the Civil War, but there's a lot more that they had involved. And you know, we've seen a lot of exhibits throughout Illinois commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, which of course is still going on. Very little thought is given to the role that women played, and that's what this exhibit is all about. And Angela, you're the curator of this exhibit, so you became very curious throughout this whole process about, you know, what were folks back home doing?
Right.
And it turns out they were doing a lot, weren't they?
They certainly were, and I'm so pleased to be able to tell that story in this exhibition. So we're really looking at the varied responses of Illinois women to the Civil War.
Now, we're going to learn terms like Sanitary Commission. We're going to learn, we're going to see what quilts symbolized, and we have a lot of quilts that were made and brought to Illinois by families that moved here. So we're going to go through this thing and learn a lot about that. But I guess the thing that stays with me is the fact that until 150th anniversary film, I'd never heard the term Sanitary Commission before, and never even thought about what women did.
Right. And again, it's a great opportunity to talk about the women of Illinois and what they were doing and the ways in which they supported the Union troops and all the different activities that they did.
Yeah.
So,
let's start by looking at this fantastic flag. Now, this is in the museum's collection, isn't it?
This is in the Illinois State Museum's collection. This flag was made in 1861. It was carried by the 33rd Regiment, the Illinois Infantry Regiment from Bloomington, Illinois. It was known as the Teachers Regiment because Charles Hovey was the organizer of this regiment, and he was the president of Illinois State Normal University, which was created to teach teachers. And so he had a number of graduates who rallied around him, and they formed a regiment, and then most of the students of the school also left. So they were called the Teachers Regiment. But the reason I love this flag is because it's a national flag, but it's not a nationally issued flag. It's a flag that was made by women of Bloomington for their local boys to carry into the flag, and it really represents the first act of patriotism. Women making flags for their regiments to carry was really the first act of patriotism that women were able to do when the war broke out.
It leads perfectly into the exhibit because it's the first thing you come to that women had made prior to the war. Put this in perspective. There was a quote in the Chicago Tribune which said, "Illinois can whip the South by herself." They thought this was going to last just a few months.
Exactly.
But turned out it was a few years, a very hard few years.
Very hard few
Over
years.
here's a good example of some of the items that Civil War soldiers carried into the field with them. This was the bare necessities, wasn't it?
It was. People, when they went off to enlist, they took things that they had from home, and sometimes through the war they carried their guns from home or their different artifacts, their different pieces from home. And women would give the boys quilts, and they would give them different memory pieces and photographs. And so this case represents the type of things that the soldiers would carry from home.
Look, just above the glasses to what they called the housewife, which was a sewing kit. Up till that point, you know, men had women to do their sewing.
Yes.
That wasn't going to happen out in the field, was it?
Exactly. So for the first time, men were asked to do certain things for themselves that they had always had their mothers or their wives do for them. So they were learning to sew, they were learning to cook, and there's a lot of stories of men in camp, and some comical stories too, men learning how to cook. And
for example, let's look at this handiwork over here that this fellow did. We were talking about, you know, learning to do your own sewing, etc. Look at the patchwork he had to do on this one.
Yeah, so this is a Union soldier's pants. It's actually owned by the Illinois State Military Museum, and it's unknown to us. But one of the reasons I love it is because it shows that in battle he had ripped his pants and he had been sewing them more than once. There are many patches that he had to put into his pants so that he could keep wearing them.
Yeah.
And again, it shows, you could compare his stitches to the stitches of the quilters that we'll see later.
Oh my goodness, there isn't any comparison, except this would keep your pants up.
Exactly.
That's about all.
We need to stay covered.
Not a work of art. Okay, we mentioned Sanitary Commission, and that's going to be a new term for a lot of people watching this program. Let's walk over there and take a look.
Okay, let's do that.
Well, Angela, women all over the North wanted to help.
Right.
But there wasn't any organized way to do that, was there?
That's right. At first they started by creating sewing circles, and they would just send their materials to their local regiments. And it became very chaotic as every town sending supplies willy-nilly to the front. And so in the fall of 1861, Abraham Lincoln called and created the United States Sanitary Commission. Now, a lot of people ask me, why sanitary?
Yeah.
Well, one thing that had been happening in the science world by the 1850s was that scientists and doctors were starting to understand that microbes or germs spread disease. And so they were trying to change the practices and clean up the hospitals, the field hospitals, so that the doctors would not cut into a man and wipe his knife off and move on to the next guy. So there was an effort to try to elevate the conditions, and so they called all their groups sanitary commissions, and they had sanitary fairs, and that's why they used the word sanitary.
Okay. And so women would get involved in these sanitary fairs. They would raise money and make things and whatever they could to send to improve the living conditions for the soldiers. And this is a terrific cabinet of items. It's an example of what they would make, right? And so
the sanitary commissions that served the Illinois region were the United States Sanitary Commission, who had a northwest branch in Chicago, and the Western Sanitary Commission, which had a branch in St. Louis. But for instance, like this pillowcase is an example of the type of things that they were sending. And the Northwest Sanitary Commission sent 48,000 pillowcases to the front, and the Western Sanitary Commission sent over 60,000. And sometimes they were gathering things from their own homes and sending them off at first, but then they got together and they started making pieces.
Well, look at these socks. Now, of course, these were all hand knitted.
These are all hand knitted, hand sewn shirts. The Northwestern Sanitary Commission sent 89,000 shirts to the front for the soldiers to wear.
Can you imagine?
And in researching this, looking at the local newspapers, they would report, oh, the ladies have gathered, there's 20 or 30 ladies in the second floor of this store, and they have 2 sewing machines. So
they're making it by hand.
They're making this all by hand, all the stitches by hand. In fact, looking at the shirt we just saw was a hand-stitched shirt, and it's just very, very moving to think about all the work that they put into that.
No kidding.
So just a wide variety of things here.
What would lint have been used for?
Lint, they were taking old textiles from their households and they were scraping lint. So they would take the lint and make fuzz, basically, and unravel their lint, because they were using that then to pack wounds. So they'd put it on the wound underneath the bandages.
Another example of the sanitary angle.
And 267,000 pounds of lint came out of the Chicago Sanitary Commission and went to the front. It's just mind-blowing.
It is mind-boggling.
To think about how many people were working together to do this.
You know, during this program, we're going to talk much more about the sanitary fairs that the women throw. But, you know, these women were running the farms, so they didn't have a lot of time.
No.
And there's also an interesting story from Decatur about feeding wounded soldiers on the train. So we're going to get those stories, too. But it's just phenomenal. It's a completely overlooked story in history.
It is. I really find that. I mean, there are very few books written about it. The county histories mention the war, but they don't mention what the women were doing. I really had to go to the local newspapers of the time to see what was happening in those towns, because they were trying to get more people to participate.
And in many cases, it was very different in each town. They were very individual efforts.
Exactly. Yeah. Every town had their story.
Okay.
So.
Well, let's go see some more.
Okay.
After you.
Okay.
Well, Angela, you have a helpful video here of a local actor. I know Linda Schneider, by the way. She's very talented.
She's wonderful. She's really wonderful.
And what she's doing is explaining what they called the Basket Brigade in Decatur. And we mentioned just a little bit earlier that each town had its own sort of signature way to help soldiers. And Decatur had a very specific one.
Yeah, they had a very special way. By 1862, there were many battles on the Western Front. And so the hospitals at Cairo, Illinois, and in northern Tennessee and Kentucky had filled up. And they needed to triage the Union soldiers who had been wounded but were healthy enough to travel north. So every day for about 9 months, they would send another trainload of wounded soldiers on the Illinois Central Railroad. Every day, when they passed through Centralia, the the station manager there would telegraph.
Telegraph, yeah. This is 1861.
Yeah, exactly. I got to get my technology straight. Telegraph to the Decatur station how many men were on the train. So they'd say 75 men are coming through tonight, 120 tonight. And so the women of Decatur were surprised at first, and they organized and they came together, and up to 30 women every night would stand on the platform waiting for the train with baskets of food and coffee and different dainties, as they call it. So they had fried chicken and pickled peaches.
Oh my goodness, they hadn't been fed like that in months.
Right, they hadn't had homemade food since they left home, probably, most likely. And the men were not allowed to get off the train, so the women walked the aisles. If you can imagine the women walking the aisles in their skirts and in civilian clothes and looking so nice. In fact, they talk about the men were like trying to spruce themselves up, trying to like look alive basically for the women. They were embarrassed by how they looked. And they were very happy to receive this food, and they were very thankful when they found that they didn't have to pay, because many of them didn't have money to pay. So
every day they would do this.
For almost 9 months.
There's nice examples over here of these are the period baskets and the jugs that the women from the brigade would carry onto the train with them.
Something like this, definitely. So with their hot biscuits.
And they probably made those baskets too.
They probably did. They absolutely probably did, or bought them from a local artisan, but yeah, all locally done.
Almost every community in Illinois had some kind of effort. In fact, you've got an interesting list of the communities.
Yes.
Let's go take a look at that.
Okay, let's do.
Okay, here's Illinois of I guess it's 1861.
That's right.
Maybe a little later, but this is what Illinois looked like. And what I find, it is 1861.
Yes.
What I love is you've done enough research to find out which villages, towns, and cities actually got involved in this movement.
And during the research, I looked at the list of every town that donated to the Northwest Sanitary Commission in Chicago and to the Illinois State Sanitary Commission in Springfield. The Western Sanitary Commission didn't make a list of everybody who donated. But I looked at that, and I found 993 Illinois towns contributed. And you know that each town had probably 20 women at least at various points during the war participating in those activities. And I just found it phenomenal, the range of support and the way that the women came together from all over the state, doing so many different types of activities, from making food. They made many pieces of food, dried fruit, canned vegetables. They sent off bushels of onions and different foodstuffs that way, as well as all the things we've been talking about for clothes and bandages and everything else. So they were so busy, and again, often and so overlooked. So.
Well, Angela, as busy as these women were helping with the war effort, they still, in most cases, had a farm to run.
Right. And that's why I chose to put this hay rake into the exhibition, because again, it shows another activity of women during the war, and some women were going out to the field for the first time. Other women had, it depends on your class at that point, but some women had been working in the field in many ways up to that point as well. But I thought it was interesting. The Prairie Farmer was actually having some 101 articles on how to do certain things. And they're targeting that to women who are for the first time working out in the fields and trying to understand how to make it work. And so this hay rake, again, it just gives us that sense, that reminder that they were breaching new territories.
Oh man, they had to keep the livestock fed. They had to get the livestock hooked up to something like this so that they could get out and get the hay. It's incredible. It's an incredible story.
And they were still raising their children and cooking and doing everything they needed to do in that way as well.
And making quilts.
And making quilts
and
on top of it.
It's part of your title of the exhibit. This, for a quilt lover, this is a phenomenal exhibit, and all of these quilts are from that period.
Right. They're all
each one has a story.
Exactly.
We have come to the place here where both of these quilts are from Mason City, and you exhibit these two for a reason.
Yes, the quilts in this gallery actually all have a story about a soldier's family. And in this case, there was a man named Philo Conkling who moved from New York State in the 1850s and settled in Mason City, Illinois, and became a teacher. When the war broke out, he enlisted. right away, and he became a prisoner of war, and he, after 2 years, he was discharged because of his ill health. He came back to Mason City and he married a young woman named Lucinda Ann Taylor. And they had a baby soon after, and she made these 2 quilts in that period, either before she got married or right after.
Let's move down to this one then and take a look at it.
This is a spectacular quilt too. But Mr. Conkling never fully recovered from the war. He passed away in 1870, and at that time they had a 4-year-old daughter, and she was 1 month from delivering their second daughter. And so within the next few months, she realized she could not support both of her children, and so she took these 2 quilts for a source of comfort, and she packed them with her 4-year-old daughter into a covered wagon, according to the family, and sent her back to New York State to be raised by her well-to-do aunt. And she stayed there the rest of her life. But again, these quilts represent the comfort and the sadness of the aftermath of the war, and it's just such a powerful story to imagine a little girl having to go through that, but yet having something like this to comfort her. So it's really touching.
Yeah.
And really appreciate the family donating these quilts to us.
Terrific. Angela, as most people know, the Union uniforms were blue, the Confederate uniforms were gray.
Right.
And you know, that wouldn't matter much to us, except we're about to look at a quilt which is exemplary of sort of the friction that was going on among families in some cases during that time.
This quilt was given to us with the family story that grandmother Sarah from Anna, Illinois, created this quilt with the uniform fragments of her 2 sons. In doing further research, we learned that Sarah Reed of Anna had a son, William, who joined the Union Army and was killed. And within a year or so later, her son Thomas came of age, and he went back to Tennessee and enlisted in the Confederate Army. And they had just moved from Tennessee within the last few years, so he returned home and enlisted as a Confederate soldier. And then, according to the family, she stitched this quilt together. And in a way, I love it because it's symbolic of stitching the country back together following the war, and just again, the way that it, as you said, it tore apart families, it tore apart the country, tore apart a mother's heart, you know, and so in a way it's just a wonderful quilt.
And you can see in here that blue and gray are the predominant colors.
Right.
But it's also interesting the way they've built this, because they've built it in the patchwork sort of resembles the log cabin, and that was real popular at that time.
Right, it's called a log cabin set, or a variation on the log cabin quilt. And it was, the first log cabin quilt was documented during the Civil War as being sold at a sanitary fair to raise money for soldiers. And, excuse me. And the log cabin is called log cabin because the way the fabric is built, it lays on one on top of
like
another,
logs,
like logs. And it was also said to be by quilt historians in honor of President Lincoln, because he was a log cabin candidate. And so this was a very popular set from after the Civil War to the beginning of the 20th century and beyond. One quilt historian has created a database, and she has found that there are very few log cabin sets comparatively coming out of southern states even after the war. This is really a sort of an expression of a particular sentimentality about the Union and about Lincoln and memory. So I really love this quilt. It's gotten a lot of attention.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Jim Zimmer, the Director of Art and History, has a lot to say with how exhibits look. You know, what's included and how they look, because it's you gotta, and you all do such a terrific job, but it's got to have a certain look, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly does, and it's not something that is instantaneous either. There's a lot of thought that goes into the presentation of whatever we're showing, and it's not just a few people that are involved either. So the curator of the exhibition, in this case Angela, is sort of the driving force behind it, but we have many individuals that are part of that process as well, in terms of, well, it's kind of a group dynamic, because we have to not only think of the concept behind it, but we have to think about how is the public going to interact with this, and how is it going to be the most comfortable for them to interact. So as we're deciding things, we, for instance, some of the cases that are in this exhibition, we had many, many more objects that we could have used to illustrate some of the points, but you reach a certain line that's too much.
You don't want to overload your visitors.
So it's a matter of trying to figure out, boiling it down, if you will, and what are the objects that are going to best represent the story. What text is going to best represent the story? And that's another thing, with the staff here is that, Angela writes the text for that, but we all contribute in terms of reading through, making suggestions, those kind of things. So it really is a group effort that way.
We've mentioned several times the Sanitary Commission during this program.
Yes. And
over here on this wall, we see an exhibit about the sanitary fairs, which we have not discussed. The first one was held in Chicago, and you can see what immense occasion this was. People coming together from probably all over the Midwest to try to help the effort of raising money and goods to send to the soldiers.
It was the fundraising event of the century kind of idea. First one was, as you said, in Chicago in 1863, and there were a lot of people that were involved. Calls went out to send to them objects that were made or objects that they had in their homes that they could in turn sell to raise money for the war effort.
So and let's look at some of those, because you have a case of those over here. And in some cases, like this clock here, these were really exceptional pieces.
Absolutely, and it wasn't just individuals. Businesses would donate objects. The clock that you cite there, that was one that was given by a business. And at the time, in 1863, when the first sanitary fair was held, that would have had a value of $100. And so in today's money, that would be about $14,000.
Wow.
So that was a significant contribution.
Absolutely.
And you don't necessarily think of all of these fancy objects like this. You don't think about that in terms of Civil War. You think of the destruction and everything else. But this was a side of it as well, to raise the money for that. So people gave objects that they had to help raise the money. Some of the objects that were there are kind of interesting also. They were Confederate war booty. The silver platter that we have in this case was something
Let's take a look up there too at the right hand top corner, that silver tray. That's what you're talking about.
Absolutely, yes. And so that's something that would have been brought back and then sold at, and those were very popular items for Northerners to purchase those kind of items originally from Confederate families. And you can see it's a broad range of different things here. We've got, in this case, and this goes back to what I was saying before, there were so many different types of items. What do you choose to represent it? And that took some doing. And as I said, we looked at several different items. We had only a certain amount of space within the exhibit that we could allot to telling the story and showing this. And so there's a lot of kind of planning. And then the way that they are mounted also, that takes another team of experts in our exhibits department.
Well, that brings up a question that I have for you, because there's a particular item in here that I know that there's a story behind mounting it, and I want you to tell me that story now. Can we go over there?
Sure,
okay,
surely.
Let's do that. Okay, now, this is... I understand that you worked on this several times for many, many hours.
It's not like you, at home in the morning, you get up and throw your clothes on. In a museum exhibit, it's a much more complicated adventure. And it is an adventure in some respects. Now, this is a dress from around 1861. It is a silk dress, which silk can be very vulnerable, so it has to be handled very, very carefully. And this one is in pretty amazing shape from that time period. A lot of times silk would actually, what we call shatter. The fibers would separate, and this one is in excellent condition. Well, in terms of exhibiting this, things that we have to think about are the light exposure, because textiles in particular, and that's true of the quilts also, are very vulnerable to certain light levels. So when we display something, we have to check the foot candles. That's how the light is measured, to make sure it's not above a certain level, because it's getting exposure day after day. Now, this exhibit is up for a considerable period of time. And because of that fact, we have decided that we will have to change out this dress halfway through and substitute it with another one so that we can preserve this for future benefit.
You kind of have to preserve it from the bottom up, though, don't you?
Well,
because you have a lot of considerations there.
And that was part of the trickiness in this particular one. It is resting on a form underneath, but it is sitting upon a platform that has been painted. And one of the things we have to be very careful about is like off-gassing from the paint. We don't want the objects, particularly textiles, to touch the painted surface at all. So in this case, we had to put a piece of glassine, which is like wax paper, it's close to that, underneath the hem, actually all the way underneath it, and then crawl in and cut it out so that it didn't show. And I hope I don't have to do that again.
On your hands and knees for several days, huh? And you finally got it right.
Well, I think so. I think so. So yeah, those are the types of things that visitors to a museum
would never
know
envision.
that.
No, that's terrific.
So it was getting this object mounted with everything concerned took more than a day to get that right. So, and multiply that by the number of objects in this exhibition.
Thank you, Jim.
You're very welcome.
Civil War Quilters, Loyal Hearts of Illinois, is up at the Illinois State Museum in Springfield until September 8th. Admission is free. It's still free. Donations are accepted. With another Illinois story in Springfield, I'm Mark McDonald. Thanks for watching.
Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you. For a DVD copy of the program you've just seen, send 1995 to Network Knowledge, P.O. Box 6248, Springfield, Illinois 62708. Be sure to include the program name, subject, and when the program aired. You can also order with your credit card by calling 800-232-3605.